Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, part 13. As a token of goodwill, one of their NCOs was seconded to me as my stores officer. He at least knew the procedures, how to order equipment, where from, and most important, what it was we needed most. Soon a mass of material began to arrive. Trucks with huge transformers inside, transmitters, receivers, drums of cables, staff cars and motorbikes. Graf von Pfeil was suitably impressed and began to interest himself more in the frantic ministrations of his young lieutenant. Now that equipment had begun to appear, it demanded attention. He couldn't miss it. I now had 4 heavy transmitter and receiver trucks, together with trailer power units, 2 trucks to carry telephone equipment, 2 750cc tuned-up motorcycle combinations, 2 BMW staff cars and 2 Kübelwagens to lay our field telephone wires with. There were 2 antenna trucks to come that had outboard 10-meter masts, but in the meantime I was very proud of my little outfit. All the vehicles except the 2 cars were brand new and caused more than a little curiosity as they were parked up in one of the hangars. Soon the covetous eyes of the squadron leaders fell upon my small fleet. I still didn't have the staff to man the vehicles and had to borrow drivers from the First Company, which is the logistics and staff company, and from the squadrons just to collect the vehicles from the depot. As this bloody Nachrichtenzug has no use for them, they argued with von Pfeil, why can't we take them from the squadrons? At least they'll be of use there instead of sitting around in the hangar until God knows when. The whole tone was that the Nachrichtenzug was never going to be used. Not if they had their way. The opposition was building. It wasn't only with the squadron leaders either. My own peers, the young lieutenants, were also courting favors from me. All sorts of emotional blackmail were used, pointing out that it was only the Spaniards who had cars except me, who was lucky to have my own DKW. I could have screamed. It was nothing to do with luck, and if they'd managed their finances positively, they might have a car too. But they persisted with the Old Pals Act. Surely, it isn't too much to ask of an old chum to lend out a BMW for a weekend. After all, it isn't even yours. There were all kinds of entreatments which came my way, but with the help of Lieutenant Möllenhoff and the determination of von Pfeil, I managed to keep the unit intact. Digging my heels in like this did little to ingratiate me with the squadron leaders and other officers. Besides, I didn't frequent the officers' club. Because Manching and Ingolstadt didn't have much social life and Munich was only really a practical journey at weekends, most of the officers spent their time in the casino, drinking beer and playing cards, sometimes all night long. Hinnerk and I had the use of my little DKW and it proved to be a delight. We enjoyed a simpler but, I think, fuller life by eating out in the local towns and joining in with Fasching parties. We always found new friends that way. For instance, on one evening we came out of a dance hall to find that my car wouldn't start. I'd had a few drinks, but not enough to cause a problem on the roads in those days, and I didn't notice that I had parked with the exhaust pipe in a snowbank. The crowd was leaving the hall and someone stepped forward and cleared the snow from the pipe, and she fired right up. I was so pleased that I offered everyone a lift home. They all piled in, and in the end there were 9 assorted males and females with Hinnerk and myself. Instead of the direct route, we went on a midnight sightseeing tour of Ingolstadt, laughing and singing as we went. We made lots of friends by getting out into the community instead of drinking at the Fliegerhorst, but it didn't help our careers much. If you didn't share the tastes of the majority, you became an outsider and didn't attract any favors. My relationship with Galland as my squadron leader became progressively more strained, and my flying suffered as a result. I didn't get a single hour's instruction from him. He always had more important things to do. In the meantime, von Pfeil, in spite of the resistance of the Spaniards, became more active regarding the Nachrichtenzug. He called Luftgaukommando in Munich and explained his communication problem. Apparently, the answers were evasive. Try to do the best you can, you're not the only unit with problems, etc. But he kept on trying and began to call some of his friends in the higher echelons of the Luftwaffe. It soon became clear that the rapid build-up of the Luftwaffe had left much reliance on good friends for progress. There hadn't been time for too much consideration, and neither promotion nor good assignments necessarily went to those with dedication, ability, or a proven work record. It had mainly been done on personal recommendation. This is why the Brotherhood of the Spaniards was so dominant in the early days. Things were expanding so quickly that it was often the dog that barked loudest who got the bone, or at least the dog who knew someone who knew that he needed a bone. I received great help and encouragement from the Nachrichtenzug of the Fliegerhorst Company. With their assistance, I drew up daily schedules of training for my personnel, and as I hadn't anyone qualified to train them, the Horst company did much of the actual instruction as well. We were making progress, but things were too slow for my liking. I hadn't had enough personnel, and I was desperately short of NCOs. It didn't help much when I was dragged away on other business, such as the case of Gefreiter Huber. Most of our equipment came from a depot at Oberpfaffenhofen, which is north of Munich. The driver of one of the trucks, Gefreiter Huber, had signed for a full load of cables and cable racks, but upon his arrival at Manching, one rack, complete with cables, was missing. Huber couldn't explain how the loss had occurred, so for the time being, he was cautioned to be careful. As was the practice, I was required to report the incident in a government periodical which was circulated throughout Germany. The entry carried my name and unit. Thus it was that one day I was called to answer my telephone to find that I was speaking to a policeman from Donauwörth. Was I Lieutenant Steinhilper? Was I looking for some cable drums? I agreed that I was and that I did. I was curtly informed that the police had the drums and they were anxious to interview the driver of the vehicle from which they had fallen. A local farmer had been killed whilst riding home on his bicycle, and the cable drums had been found with the body. I really didn't need this kind of problem at the time, what with things being so difficult with the Nachrichtenzug, but it would be a valuable experience to appear in court as the defending officer for the airman. However, it was yet another complication which I could have done without. When the whole truth came out, the story was that the driver had not seen the farmer on the bicycle until the very last minute because it was nighttime and there were no lights on the machine. The driver had pulled the truck violently to the left to miss the cyclist and thought that he'd passed him all right. Apparently, he didn't realize that the drums of cable had fallen off or, more importantly, that they had hit and killed the unfortunate farmer. The Gefreiter was busted to airmen, but otherwise he escaped any real problems. That didn't apply to me though. The Spaniards took it as ammunition to use against this uppity young lieutenant who wouldn't let them play with his cars. Now the bloody Nachrichtenzug have killed an innocent farmer, dragging the squadron's good name through the courts and the mud. On reflection, it all looks rather pathetic now, but at the time it really upset me. When I look back at the responsibilities which were loaded on my young shoulders compared with what in my later business experience I expected of 20-year-olds, I am amazed that I didn't have some kind of breakdown. Slowly I was beginning to grow in confidence. Von Pfeil and Lieutenant Möllenhoff were behind me, advising me not only to request the cooperation of the squadron leaders, but to try to go out and sell my product to convince them of its value. I thought that I'd be a little more subtle and try to win over other members of the personnel first, and started to talk with the Funkwarte, which are the radio technicians on the squadrons. They had radio equipment in stock, ready to fit to the 109s. Some were trying to fit them in secret, such was the opposition. I worked hard on the Werkmeister, getting them to change the frequencies on the quartz crystals, but they were very wary in case the squadron leaders found out, and they told me what I already knew. I'd have to convince the Spaniards before any real progress could be made. I knew that it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way ahead, and I decided to beard the lion in his den. So I went looking for the squadron leaders. Hearing that both Ewald and Galland were in the same office in one of the hangars, I decided to see if I could speak to them both at the same time. I knocked on the door and entered, my sales platter already running in my mind. But what I saw took my attention immediately, and I forgot my best pitch. Tied up close to a very hot radiator was Galland's dog. Being keen on hunting and in particular shooting, Galland always had a retriever of some kind. The dog was stock still, concentrating on a piece of sausage which had been hung up a few inches from his nose. He couldn't reach it and was probably very uncomfortable, being so close to the hot radiator. My attention now taken by this scene, I asked Galland what was happening, and he explained casually that the dog had behaved badly at its last meeting with a sausage and that it would have to learn to modify its instincts. He had sentenced the hapless animal to 2 hours in this present position. I tried to talk radio, but the strange scene had knocked me off balance and I really couldn't recover. Perhaps if I'd known just how influential Galland was, I would have tried harder. Later, one day when I was least expecting anything radical to happen, I had a message from von Pfeil to change into my number 1s and report to his office. Then, without any further briefing, I was driven in his Wanderer staff car to the Luftgau Munich, the Luftwaffe district headquarters. I arrived in the afternoon and reported to the guardhouse and was immediately ushered up to meet General Martini, the senior ranking officer of the Luftnachrichtentruppen. It was almost like a dream, or nightmare, for me. 1 minute I was employed on my day-to-day tasks, then, a few hours later, and with no briefing or time to prepare, I was standing in front of a general. Like many people who have risen to high rank, he was very approachable and not half the ogre I thought he might have been. I soon felt at ease as he listened attentively to my story, detailing to him how I saw the role of the Nachrichtenzug, both in defense and offense. He nodded his head in agreement to many things that I said, and then he told me that he knew that I had some problems, although he never actually related how he came to learn of them. As the General listened and occasionally asked pertinent questions, I reviewed the situation at Manching. There was no shortage of equipment, the hardware was first class. What I lacked was personnel and the skilled technicians to train them. I suppose it was part of the man's skill that he made me feel important and, as a consequence, quite bold with my remarks, especially when it came to the behavior of the Spaniards. Again, he took it all in and assured me that I wasn't alone in my problems. Most of the newly allocated Nachrichtenoffiziere were new to their task and had no experience. Also that I was far from alone in my problems with the Condor Legion veterans. In return for my candor, I was told that things would soon be changing for the better and that my fully trained personnel would soon be arriving. As a bonus, most of them had been drawn from high school graduates and the majority of them would have amateur radio backgrounds. But as for NCO training officers, he couldn't promise too much. The new communications arm of the services was expanding as fast, if not faster than the Luftwaffe, and there just hadn't been time to build up the kind of background experience to produce experienced and capable teaching staff. Anyone who showed promise was usually quickly transferred to aircrew, but I was assured that I would get at least one capable NCO and all the help that they could manage from the Fliegerhorst-Nachrichtenzug. After just 15 minutes, the meeting was brought to a close. In that time, which had seemed to me much more, we had exchanged a huge amount of information, and I felt as though things would change for the better. The General advised me to try to keep selling the idea to the experts and not be discouraged. Things would change in time. They would have to, after all, we were on the brink of the 1940s. It was obvious that there was a technological revolution going on, which was apparent in our aircraft, our cars, and in particular in the Wehrmacht. Communications would have to improve. We would not be able to carry on like a group of small boys with empty tins tied together with string. Communications would be the key to the future. It would be a tragedy if we were to let the Spaniards continue to live in the past. With the assurance that within 1 month a new and much improved course for Luftnachrichtenoffiziere from the fighter groups would begin at the Luftnachrichtenschule in Halle, I left feeling that at last I was getting somewhere. But I didn't let this go to my head or to hope for too much. I had already been disappointed too often for this. During the journey back to Manching, I turned the whole experience over in my mind and prepared myself to brief von Pfeil first thing the next morning. I was now hopeful, but it just sounded too good to be true. I thought I'd just wait and see. Generalmajor Martini turned out to be a man of his word. Within 2 months, I got over 50 young and highly motivated young recruits, most of whom had exactly the right background. They had spent hours at their homes trying to contact friends on the amateur frequencies, either with the crude crystal set or, in some cases, with the home-built valve sets. They couldn't wait to get their hands on the shiny new equipment which had power potentials of which they had only dreamed. And, true to his word again, I got an experienced NCO, Unteroffizier Krähe. He was a good all-rounder with experience of short, middle and long-wave transmissions. He was even disappointed that operational fighter units didn't have any plans for direction-finding equipment. He was familiar with its operation and considered that it was essential for a fighter group, whilst I was still struggling to get the field telephone accepted. Here was the only problem. Until I could work the unit up as a whole, I couldn't give them a free hand with the equipment. So here I had these very intelligent young men full of technical knowledge and energy, and I had to make some of them sit and operate the switchboard. That wasn't the kind of challenge or stimulation that they needed, but it would have to do until we could move forward under control. Things now began to move on at a pace. Barely had I begun to get to know Krähe and to get him introduced to my friends within the Fliegerhorst-Nachrichtenzug when I was ordered to attend the Luftnachrichtenschule at Halle-Saale. The course, I was told, was to be of 4 weeks duration and had been specifically designed for the Nachrichtenoffizier from the Jagdgruppen, which were the fighter groups. The invitation was also addressed to the individual group commanders who were cordially invited to furnish their attending numbers with aircraft. They would be required to take a 109 along for the group and to undergo practical radio training whilst also providing a live target for the trainees. Halle had a serviceable airfield, but no aircraft or pilots on its own. Von Pfeil gave his permission for me to take one of the 109 Deltas, which had been assigned to his staff flight. Things were really looking up for me. I was getting quite excited, but I had begun to learn that this is a dangerous sign. Most times, when things began to look so good, there had been a disaster just around the corner, and this was just such a case. I didn't know what was waiting for me just a few days away. Just before my departure on the weekend of the 18th onto the 19th February, it was my turn to be duty officer. I was the youngest officer and had some knowledge of the operations of the tower from my time with the Fliegerhorst-Nachrichtenzug. I'd also had some dealings with the Wetterwarte, which is the meteorological service, and ground operations. It was difficult, therefore, to resist pressure when the majority of other officers wanted the weekend clear. I was junior buck and was capable of doing the job. Senior rank had its privileges, and dumping the job on me was one of them. And so it was that some of the officers drove out to Munich, whereas others wanted to get to Berlin. Oberleutnant Klein and Lieutenant Möllenhoff, my immediate senior, badly wanted to get to Berlin, the official reason being that they wanted to view the Berlin Motor Show because there would be some new military vehicles there as well as the civilian models. We had known all week that our Tante Ju would be going to the capital with a nighttime stopover. Many of the station staff were lining up to get on the Junkers because they had family or girlfriends in Berlin, and this was an opportunity not to be missed. Now it was Saturday morning, and from the tower I could see the Junkers being prepared for flight, but I didn't think it would be going anywhere. The weather was bad and looked like getting worse. It was cold with a low and heavy cloud base and snow flurries in the wind. I kept ringing for weather, but there was no sign that it would improve in the near future, and there was also the possibility of icing. It seemed as though every few minutes some hopeful would come in to see if things were improving, but realistically, they weren't. There were 450 kilometers between us and Berlin, and there was no chance that this could be done without a substantial amount of blind flying. Most of the pilots with a blind flying rating went to bomber and transport squadrons straight from the flying school, and we didn't have many pilots with the right rating. I had, therefore, to refuse the permission for the flight to proceed. Once more, pressure was brought to bear upon me to let them go, another touch of the old pal's act. And again, I was in an invidious position, being a junior officer and being the youngest, but I stuck to my guns and kept the Junkers on the ground. Finally, Oberleutnant Klein came in to tell me that he had discovered that one of the Unteroffiziere on the flight had an IMC, which is Instrument Meteorological Conditions rating. That was it. They could go, and in a way, it was a relief for me. At noon, the Junkers 52 lumbered down the runway with its 11 passengers and crew and gradually climbed away into the dark and forbidding sky. Gradually, the drone of the three 600 horsepower BMW Hornet engines faded away, and I got on with my routine bookings and checks. Later that evening, whilst I was in my quarters, the tower called me to tell me that the Junkers had not reached Berlin and that it had been classed as overdue. On the Sunday morning, the confirmation came. It had tried to clear some hills north of Eger in a snowstorm, and with heavy icing, it hadn't made it. Our old Tante Ju, together with 11 men whom I knew and with whom I had worked, were now one tragic mess of human and man-made wreckage. The confirmation of the crash and the fact that there were no survivors hit me like the icy blasts of wind which now screamed across the empty room. I felt the pressure of it all being dropped onto my young shoulders. Another disaster has struck, and this time it is again due to being careless with the elements. Flying in inclement weather, even though you know that it is dangerous, is one of the leading causes of general aviation accidents. Apparently, so it was back then too. I believe most of you who are interested in aviation are familiar with the term "get there-itis," the mindset that I'll make it somehow, I'm sure it's not that bad. This has cost many pilots their lives. It is also interesting to see how our young lieutenant is struggling to change things for the better, only to hit a brick wall with the old guard. This too hasn't changed much today. But anyway, thanks for listening. I will see you in the next episode. Cheers. Bye bye.